Okay, so today we're going to be going over the second part of our Reconstruction notes. We're going to focus on some of the challenges that they had in the South, and I showed you this map last time. The South had been broken up into 5 different military districts, and that was until they followed the rules of the North, which were mainly pass the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, 14th Amendment to give citizenship to former slaves, and then finally pass the 15th Amendment to allow all men to vote regardless of race. Between 1868 and 1870, all Southern states did that. They were able to rejoin the Union. With a new voting base in the South of minorities, they were able to elect Republican-dominated state governments, because what minority would want to vote for a Democrat at that point? The Democrats were mainly the ones responsible for forming the Confederacy and trying to split away from the country, in large part so they could keep slaves. Let's look at the South. A lot of it was destroyed. They had some big problems to try to overcome. Buildings were damaged. You can see a few of the big cities here, Charleston, South Carolina, and the Confederate capital, Richmond, Virginia. They were in absolute ruins. Well, they had to rebuild these, and it's going to cost a lot of money. Railroad tracks were destroyed on purpose by the Union. Bridges were blown out. Roads were destroyed, and there were human remains all over the place. There's actually a picture in your book, if you want to look through the Reconstruction segment, where they have people who have full-time jobs of just going around and picking up all the skeletons in the years after the war, because there were tens of thousands of bodies that were just never picked up. But because of all this, the property values dropped. Nobody wants to live in an area filled with human remains, with no roads, bridges, all the buildings are damaged. So if you were living there and you wanted to get out, you had to sell your property really cheap. You were going to take a huge loss. 1 out of every 5 adult white men in the South died in the war, so your workforce is definitely compromised there. And the solution to all this, you have less people, property values have dropped, you have all these things that need to be fixed, is they decide to do higher state taxes. So the burden is really on the shoulders of the people who are still left in the South. A lot of people are going to try to get the heck out of there while they can. Here's some political participants. You had scalawags. Well, at this point in history, if you were a white Southerner and you were a Democrat, and now there was a black voting base, you knew that your chances of getting into office were pretty slim. So what you did was you switched over and you joined the Republican Party. And you pretended that you supported civil rights. You supported the right to vote for the African Americans. And for the most part, it was a big lie. They didn't really intend that. They just pretended they would so they could get elected, and then they could continue to enforce Democrat policies, which were extremely racist in nature. The carpetbaggers, I mean, check this guy out. This is like something I could see in a nightmare. This guy is showing up at your door. The carpetbaggers were Northern Republicans. They moved to the South after the war. Their whole mission was, they knew that Southerners were desperate to get out. They knew that there was a lot of land that used to be worth a lot of money that could be bought up really cheap. And someday, when all the roads were fixed, when the bridges were fixed, railroads were built again, which was inevitable, maybe 20, 30 years down the road when the South was reconstructed, it'd be worth tons of money again. So they'd go down there, they'd buy cheap, and then they'd be sitting on a fortune. The largest group of Southern Republicans, obviously, is going to be former slaves. Republicans were the group that worked hard to end slavery. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. So it's estimated that about 9 out of 10 African Americans supported the Republican Party. So much that by 1870, Hiram Revels is the first African American elected to the U.S. Senate, which is just remarkable when you really think about it, because in this country, 5 years before this, Hiram Revels could have been a slave just because of his skin color. And now he is one of the leaders of the country sitting in Congress by 1870. That's very quick progress. And that's what the radical Republicans in Congress were shooting for. Quick progress. Some of the challenges of former slaves. Well, they had no land, jobs, tools, money. Most of them had been confined to plantations their entire lives, so the only skill they had was farming. A lot of them wanted to get away from that way of life, so they moved to cities, especially southern cities, which all double in population. To try to keep a lot of former slaves in the area because they were skilled in farming and they didn't want to see that region totally die as a big farming center, the government set aside 44 million acres of land in the South. It was called the Southern Homestead Act of 1866. The problem was, and we're not really sure if the government did this on purpose or not, but a lot of that land stunk. It was swampy, it just wasn't good for farming, and they didn't give them the necessary tools that they needed to try to farm the land, so that was a problem. By 1870, 80% of freed African Americans over 20 years old were illiterate, couldn't read or write, so this really limited your job opportunities. What the government really needed to do at this point was to step in and provide some kind of education, which we do see with the Freedmen's Bureau, which is one of the laws passed by the radical Republicans. It does build schools for African Americans in the South. And this is just to show you how the African American population has changed over the years. In the map to the left, we can see the dark blue areas. Those are where most of the African Americans lived before the Civil War, when slavery was at its height. If you look at the one on the right, we can see how that population has moved, especially away from rural areas in the South to big cities in the North and the West, and definitely further up the East Coast. Because if you look at the one on the left, most of the big population ends around Virginia, Maryland, and that's it. Now, if you look at the more heavily populated areas, it's more northeast. You get New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts in the mix. And there's a few areas out in the West Coast in California, and around the Great Lakes you have Detroit, Chicago. So that is the Reconstruction Notes Part 2. We saw some of the problems that the South was facing, some of the issues that African Americans had to overcome, and some of the things the government was doing to address these problems.